Or is, no? Okay, keep going. All right. Well, I am so happy to be here. Was that not a great first session? Give everybody a hand. All good. I just think that sets us up so nicely for the next day and a half. I'm already excited about what we're going to do. Except there's one caveat that I have to tell you right off the bat, because I'm so honored to be able to be here and MC this event. But my family is on baby watch. We are in countdown mode for our 6th grandchild. And should my phone ring, bye-bye. So if suddenly you don't see me, you'll know where I am. Although I was told this morning I'm good to go, so we'll see how that happens. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for the 10th Birth to 5 Water Cooler Conference. 10 years, how can that be? Really, it seems like yesterday that we started conversations about a water cooler and what that would be. And thanks to the Advancement Project, but thanks mostly to Molly Munger, who's right here, and to my predecessor at First 5 California, Chris Perry, who really were the two that got this and pushed until we all showed up. So really, they had the vision for bringing early learning and care, the field together, to elevate key policy issues, to build on the expertise in the field that you all bring, and to advance equity, both educational and racial. Our shared goal and vision to see California build strong systems in the areas of infant toddlers, as you've heard today, of our dual language learners, and supporting our partnerships with families was there then as it is still today. So over the next couple of days, we will shine the spotlight on a few things. We're going to explore the early childhood education policy landscape, supporting, and this is just like, I love that we're talking about this, supporting the whole child from the start by elevating developmental health and learning needs of California's infants and toddlers and their families. We are going to talk about the babies, and that's so critical and important to our state. We're expanding the discussion of quality to reflect the diverse needs of our youngest learners, including our dual language learners. Fortifying ECE policy and advocacy with the voice of community and the lens of racial equity. Building on ECE principles and pedagogy of greater birth to 12 alignment. We heard that today. I heard not only Senator Mitchell, but 2 well-known people in K-12 reaching out to us to say, let's get this together and do it as one. So I just want to say we're all here, we're ready to go, and we'll have coffee anytime you want. So very excited. The water cooler has always been about making connections, and this year is no exception, beginning, as we saw, with the discussion of gubernatorial candidates. Fascinating and very exciting to hear their views on what they envision for the future. As John said earlier, we are witnessing the future of California with these conversations today and tomorrow. I want to just call out how much we appreciate the work of Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Our friends at the foundation are committed to ensuring California's next governor is a champion for young children. And having us all have the opportunity to listen and have a voice is just helping that to happen. So I know we were invested in that conversation today, as we will be tomorrow. I also want to take just a moment to call out some friends who are in the audience today with us and acknowledge those from legislative offices who are here to listen and observe and take part in these conversations. If you could stand up when I call your name. Jessica Sams, who's the assistant to the speaker. Anthony Rendon. Gail Gronert, our good friend, Gail Groner, there you are. Oh, right in front of me. Great. Who's also a special assistant to the speaker. Buck Ellingson, who is with Assemblymember Mark Levine's office somewhere, I think. And last but not least, Ryan Van Zylen, legislative aide to Assemblymember Jackie Irwin, excuse me. Thank you. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here and look forward to conversations with all of you. But right now we're going to get started with our first keynoter of the conference. And I'd like to introduce to you Rashid Malik, who is a policy analyst for early childhood. Oh, we're not. I was going to say, you don't look like him.
I don't look like Rashid.
Okay.
But I'm nothing if not generous, and you all have been an extraordinary audience. You could use a break.
Oh.
Assuming. So why don't we go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll fully shift over to this next part of the agenda.
Oh.
So we'll go with that.
Perfect.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right, folks, let's go ahead and get started again. I'm nothing if not prompt. Generous and prompt. Come on, people. Let's go and get back in your seats. Let's go and get started again. Seats. I'm just for the camera, not for you guys. All right, let's go ahead and get this party started. We have some more very extraordinary, very exciting speakers coming up tonight, to close us out. Good, let's grab your coffees, get refueled. Go and grab your seats again. All right, why don't I go and get us started? So, I'm back up here now to officially close out the gubernatorial candidates conversation. We've got to be very crisp about that. That section is over, and now kicking off the birth through 5 water cooler. And so now we're going to spend some time over the next day or so talking about the littlest ones, our youngest learners. And to get us kicked off, I wanted to just say a few quick things. First of all, I wanted to share just a little bit about my history on this issue and my journey at the Advancement Project. So one of my very first projects at AP was to start an online GIS mapping technology project off the ground called healthycity.org. Now, I studied music and psychology and philosophy in college, so I don't know what really qualified me to run an online GIS mapping technology project, except I look like I'm straight out of Central Casting to run an online GIS mapping technology project. So I went with it. I ran with it. And so this project here, okay, I'm going to need this. There you go. So healthycity.org. It, in the end, became one of the largest that we've seen both in the state and in the country in terms of a compilation of data sets publicly accessible for anyone to smush up, that's a technical term, and actually create maps of their community needs and to make sure that they have what they need to actually advocate for their community. And so beyond the whiz-bang technology, beyond the huge number of data sets, and I think at the high water mark, Chris Ringwald's here, and he actually helped us pull this all together. We had about 2,000 different data sets all crammed into this one system. The most extraordinary thing about it is it allowed us just to, on the fly, explore just what the heck was going on the ground in California throughout the entire state. And so I was able to, on the fly, create maps like this, okay? So who's from LA? All right, what are we looking at? Someone shout out. What are we looking out there on that map? Okay, that's not so good shouting. Okay, so just a bunch of mumbling, really. Okay, so what we're looking at here is South LA. Okay, the up and down red line is the 110 freeway. The sort of top of that would be downtown, and from there you go to what was called South Central, but is now South LA. Now the darker green areas is where there are higher concentrations of youth, 0 to 18-year-olds. Okay, and those red splotches are where there are higher numbers of firearm-related hospitalizations. In other words, where people are getting shot. Okay, so already right off the bat, you see the overlap between the number of kids and the number of people getting shot and how much trauma they're exposed to through this violence, right there in their neighborhoods. Okay, then we would think, all right, well, we're an enlightened society. We want to make sure that the resources to address this question is based right where those splotches are, where those red splotches are. Let's say, for example, trauma centers. If you get shot, you got to go somewhere, and so hopefully those dots of where you go are right there where those red splotches are. And lo and behold, that's not the case. Okay, if you can see on this map, those red dots include the trauma centers, and they're actually in the almost exact opposite area of where people are getting shot most. Okay, let me show you that again. All right, that's where folks are getting shot. That's where the hospitals are. Okay, it's almost as though the resources were allergic to the need. Okay, but then you can then on this system say, okay, well, what do they have in these neighborhoods? And then plop up liquor stores, and off you go. Okay, so I don't know what kind of messaging we were trying to send to these youth and to the people who lived in this neighborhood in terms of a lack of resources like actual hospitals, but maybe you have to medicate yourself some other way with all these liquor stores. Okay? Now, the most extraordinary thing about this set of maps, is not sort of the impact of actually seeing the visuals. That certainly is important. But it's the fact that myself and the Healthy City team, we were asked to do hundreds of presentations and trainings all up and down the state. And almost without fail, we would be able to create a set of maps like these. Okay, it didn't matter if it was in the Bay Area or Fresno, San Diego, or Northern California. The team would show up in the area, kind of figure out what zip code it is, and play around for about 10, 15 minutes, and boom, you see a map like this. Okay? This kind of allergic resource planning, unfortunately, was a bit endemic in terms of what we were able to see through all the data sets that we were able to capture through healthycity.org. So that's point number one I wanted to make. Point number two that I wanted to make is that the older I get, the more I realize how right my mother was. Now, it's okay for me to admit that she just got on a plane. She's headed back to Korea to go visit some relatives. She's 6,000 miles away from me, so I could publicly admit that she was right all along. But one of the things that she really kind of drilled into me is that there was always a consequence to neglect. Okay? She said that in the context of my dirty room or not eating my vegetables, but that theme still holds. There's always a consequence to neglect. Now, as I get older, I'm a homeowner. I hear drip, drip, drip somewhere. I'm like, I'm busy. I can't deal with that drip, drip, drip. I'll worry about it later. Boom, the roof bill comes. Okay? I, unfortunately, this summer had to spend way too much time at the dentist. I had a little bit of a pain in my teeth, and I was too busy. I was like, can't be that bad. I'll just bear and get through it. Boom, root canal. I know it was painful. I know. So there's always a consequence for neglect. And when you see maps like this, and you see them all up and down the state, you gotta wonder, what is gonna be the consequence for all this neglect? Let's be very clear, right? This doesn't just happen anywhere. For the most part, where you see these empty deserts, and we're gonna talk more about ECE deserts, and I'm really excited that we'll see some of this new research, but this is from several years ago, right? It's predominantly low-income kids of color that are living in those areas. Now, what will be the consequence of that neglect, right? I think we're already starting to see some of that with the ballooning criminal justice system that we've had to deal with. I think coupled with our housing costs, we're going to continue to see all of our businesses and our schools struggling to find qualified workers. Okay, so there is a looming cost to this negligence that's coming. And so it's something that we all need to very much take seriously. Now, for the early care and education system and the field in particular, we've talked a lot about over the 10 years about what it is that we need to be doing, the kind of research that we need to be pushing out there, the kind of advocacy we need to be doing. And as I said earlier today, it is game time. We really need to figure out how to step it up. Okay, because this negligence is gonna have a consequence, and in some ways it's up to all of us here to help save California from itself at some points, okay? Things that we really need to be pushing, and this is something that we've heard from a lot of our partners, is for this system to let go of some antiquated notions. We used to think that it was too confusing for kids to learn multiple languages, but actually the research shows it's the exact opposite. Actually, you get boosted, improved achievements, right? Academic achievements, and social-emotional health when you teach children multiple languages at the earlier stage. So we need to let go of some of those old notions. We need to also engage community in these conversations. Actually, so many years ago, Molly Munger and I were in this big initiative with Maldiff and other folks to actually build out new childcare facilities in cities like Bell and Bell Gardens. And so we actually would go into the community and take maps and say, hey, where do you want to build new preschools? Okay? And these parents would say, hey, we live here, we have to walk here for work, why not in this area? Build in this area. They would put a dot on the map. They would say, actually our church is packed Saturday and Sunday, but wide open, Monday through Friday. They would put a dot on the map. Why don't you build here? Okay? They also would say, there's always these two creepy dudes hanging out in this particular corner, so they would put a red sticker on the map, don't build here. Okay? Now let me tell you, we did not have the two creepy dudes database. Okay? We did not have that sort of eyes on the ground, the expertise to really know where to build and not to build. And so you need to have community. You need to have an expanded view of who's an expert and who should have say on what the needs are and how to address those needs. So you need to engage community. The last couple things I want to say, and I want to note this again, these maps just didn't happen on their own. okay? We unfortunately inherited a legacy of intentional disinvestment, mostly in communities of color. It wasn't us, we could say. Our generation of leadership is not about this kind of racist policy, we could say. But that doesn't matter, right? We are inheriting these conditions. And until we start making all of our decisions based on the idea that we simultaneously have to address the past and build towards the future, we're gonna keep seeing that consequence to this neglect, okay? So with that, I just wanna end. One exciting thing about this water cooler overall is that we've been doing this for 10 years now, the Birth to 5. Pretty extraordinary. A round of applause for everyone here. Come on. When we got started, the idea was that the field and the politics of ECE needed some work. There was a lot of energy spent sort of opposing each other as opposed to moving the ball down the field for all the kids in California. And so we needed to create a space where we can kind of get to learn from one another, get to know one another, and figure out what a more unifying and cohesive agenda might look like. Okay, now 10 years later, it is hugely improved. It's not perfect, but it's hugely improved all the way to the point where the last couple of years, we and our partners started to ask the question, what's next? What should we be doing with this institution now called the water cooler? And so the idea came forward to take these two water coolers, Birth to 5 and K through 12, and again, the technical term is smush these two together, so we actually grow the tent and figure out how to be more cohesive across the entire pipeline for these kids, okay? And so today, we're kicking off the final Birth to 5 water cooler, which is a little sad. But next year we'll be, there you go, that was good. But next year we'll be pivoting then to the birth through grade 12 water coolers, and we're hoping everyone here can join us as we shift into that new space. Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna now introduce, I'm gonna take some of Camille's load, yes? Okay, I'm gonna introduce Rashid Malik, our next speaker. Rashid is a policy analyst at the Early Childhood Policy at the Center for American Progress. He's done some extraordinary research around the child care infrastructure and supply, and so I'm really excited to see what he has to share with us. So Malik, please.
Thank you. Okay, is this working? Great. Oh, just need the clicker. Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. I'm already so inspired from the gubernatorial roundtable. That was just great. Thank you to John, and thanks to Carla for actually reaching out to me and getting me out here to talk about some of our recent work, which is, I'm going to go ahead here. I'm going to be talking about a kind of a national level picture. You're the California experts, and so I'm not going to try and step into that space. I've already learned that you guys really know your props. I gotta say, I was a little lost on the props 13 and 78, but I'm sure that can be easily Googled, and I can get up to speed on that. We recently did some work on what we call childcare deserts, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And we have some mapping tools, which I don't think I have any maps in this presentation, but I will direct you to childcaredeserts.org, where we have some cool maps of, including California. Caveat, we are working to include all the small family childcare providers, and my thanks to the California Child Care Research and Referral group there for helping us get that extra bit of data in there. Only about 15,000 of those in California. So we're going to be updating that data set and making sure that we have a full picture of the childcare infrastructure in California. So again, I am a policy analyst with the Center for American Progress, and we're a kind of full-service progressive policy think tank in DC, and we're really proud to do a lot of work in Birth to 5. We do everything on work from home visiting to childcare supply and quality to pre-K through 3 continuity and but I am going to start with a little history lesson. And I know, like I said, we have a lot of experts in the room, but I'll be interested to know afterwards if anybody knows all three of these stories. So the first is going to be about infant schools. So many people don't know that the first early care and education movements actually started in Europe before this time, but in the 1820s in the US, alongside the development of public schools in places as diverse as Detroit and Boston, but also in rural areas. And these were focused originally on teaching kind of morality to children in poverty. But middle class and affluent families kind of became interested in the benefits. And this is around the time of the rise of developmental psychology and the field of psychology generally. And they felt that, well, these poor kids are getting a head start. That's, I think, actually where the term maybe came from. I mean, does this sound familiar? Here's a painting, actually, of a infant school from the 19th century. Not too different from our preschool that my kids go to. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. The thing is, people were realizing that there are kids are learning all the time, like we've heard some of our speakers say. And if we can get them into the developmentally appropriate learning environments, there are all kinds of wonderful educational benefits. And that can start as early, for them, it started as early as 18 months. But then, this is wonderful that John's opening remarks kind of synced up with my talk here in a way that I didn't plan, but I'm going to take credit for. This was these are all three different inflection points, and John spoke about this is a potential inflection point for California. The thing that happened in the 1830s is this guy, Amariah Brigham, who was kind of like the Dr. Phil of early 19th century America, he published some research that he said that early childhood education overstimulated the brain and probably led to insanity. So the donations that were funding a lot of these infant schools kind of dried up after all this information got out into the popular magazines at the time, and the donations fell, and the whole thing kind of collapsed by the 1850s. I think I read in one book that in 1840, there's an estimate that in Massachusetts, 40% of 3-year-olds were in infant schools. Second story is the Lanham Act. We see one of our Rosie the Riveters here. The Lanham Act was an emergency legislation passed to allow for grants that would get us ready for war. And this was a federally subsidized national child care program. It was universal, it was available to all. It was because we needed our women in the labor force. Women, at home here really drove the construction of the planes and tanks and bullets and everything that we needed for World War II. And this was kind of a little, sadly, because of the war, a natural experiment on a national child care system. It was open 6 days a week for 50 cents a day, which is around $7 a day in current terms. And Chris Herbst, who many of you know his research at Arizona State University, he's researched this extensively, and he found that the program showed increases in maternal labor force participation even as late as 5 years after the war, and that it had really strong persistent effects for the kids who participated in the child care programs. In fact, when the program was up for being made permanent, Eleanor Roosevelt advocated strongly for it to be kept. Sadly, it didn't, and she said here, "The closing of child care centers throughout the country certainly is bringing to light the fact that these centers were a real need. Many thought they were purely a war emergency measure, but a few of us had an inkling that perhaps they were a need which was constantly with us, but one we had neglected to face in the past. The third story is about, many of you have probably heard this, or maybe if you're old enough, followed this and know the sad tale of the Comprehensive Child Development Act. Would have been a wonderful federally funded network of child care centers, universally available with tuition subsidized depending on the family's income. It was going to start at around $1 billion a year, or I think $2 billion a year, which is in current dollars $10 billion. Had bipartisan support, passed through the Congress. At this time, of course, women are gaining more access to the labor force, but without quality child care providers in their area or that are affordable to them, motherhood is often kicking them back out of the workforce. And this is a case of, I would argue, what we need is a kind of government intervention in the case of a market failure. We too often have relied on this American idea of free market capitalism for education. That just doesn't work. That's why we have public schools. And then sadly, here's the villain in this story, is Pat Buchanan. He called it the Sovietization of American children. This was no doubt a reaction to the feminist movement, and anti-feminist groups really coalesced around this. And this message has really persisted for years, and we still hear all the time, the government should not be raising America's children. That message is going to die. That message is increasingly becoming radical, and people are realizing it. So lessons learned here, I would argue, are that there are going to be these recurring same challenges to expanding the quality ECE systems in the US. But there are these three consistent ideas that run through, and that's that we have reams of research showing that there are educational benefits with spillovers to criminal justice expenditures and all kinds of other things that I don't need to tell you about. There are the labor force participation benefits so that we can actually get the most out of our economy that we think we can get. For too long, there were legal barriers and institutional barriers to women and people of color joining the workforce. Those legal barriers are gone, but we still have a lot of systemic and cultural barriers that are keeping many women out of the workforce. And then without thoughtful government intervention, the market for early childhood education, early care and education really can't properly function. So we argue all the time that we need solutions for families, for children, for the workforce. ECE is going to happen because it's so important. But where are we going to focus to address these issues? And there's definitely issues around funding. It's appropriately expensive to educate young children and care for them. We need to have quality alongside that. We need a well-paid, professionalized workforce. And we need access. And today I'm going to focus a little bit on just one component of access, because we hear all the time about the cost of care, and that is certainly a concern. And I had, until last month when my daughter started kindergarten, I had 2 kids in childcare, and it was very expensive, appropriately expensive. But other thing that we don't get to hear enough about is supply. And so what we did is, starting last year, we started collecting data on the locations and the licensed capacity of child care providers. And we started with 8 states. In this year's report, we got that up to 22 states, and really hoping that we can get those last 28 to have a full measure of the child care market across the US. And what we wanted to play with was this idea of child care deserts. So everyone, I would expect, is familiar with food deserts. We define a child care desert as an area, in this case we're talking about census tracts, as an area with at least 50 children under the age of 5, but either no child care providers or insufficient supply to meet the demand. I think I have a typo in there. But you can see on this figure that it's census tracts where there are more than three kids under the age of 5 for every child care slot, licensed child care slot. And if you go to childcaredeserts.org, you can look at the national view, and you can also click on California and enter your address or your city or your zip code and see on there. And like I said, caveat is we're adding in the small family child care providers. And because of some quirks in how we weren't able to get addresses for all of those, you won't see them show up as dots on the maps. But you do get a sense of where childcare is clustered and where there are areas where the demand is really falling behind, or where supply is falling behind demand. You can also check out our report, Mapping America's Childcare Deserts. The top lines from that are that half of the families in the US are in childcare deserts. We had 22 states, but that covers 2/3 of the population, since we have all the big states in there, California included. One thing that we found is that rural communities are hit hardest, and that may not surprise you because infrastructure in a lot of service provision is weaker in rural areas for a number of reasons. 58% of Americans in rural areas live in childcare deserts. It's notable that even when you include family child care providers, the rural communities are still undersupplied. Family child care providers do amazing work in rural areas. Without them, there would be much worse, actually, for child care supply. So what we did is we took all of this child care locations and capacity data, and then we married that with census data at the census tract level. So we're able to analyze what the differences are in the demographics of the communities. And we found that Latino communities were more likely to be childcare deserts. 57% of Hispanic and Latino residents in the US live in childcare deserts. It's also the case that American Indian and Alaska Native communities are more likely to be childcare deserts. We also find significant associations between childcare deserts and maternal labor force participation. So this is a graph of female labor force participation between 1960 and 2000. It nearly doubles from about 37% to 60%. But this is us relative to other industrialized economies since 2000. You can see that we have gone down from 77 to 74%, and that's amongst women ages 25 to 54. All the other countries on this list, on this graph, have implemented significant paid leave and or child care assistance policies or had them already in place, and as you can see, have blown past us. Whereas before, we were actually leading the world in our ability to allow women into the workforce. We're now falling behind. And this is a graph from our study. You can see here the dark blue bars are areas with adequate childcare supply, and the light blue bars are childcare deserts. And we find that the childcare deserts are associated with significantly lower rates of maternal employment. Amongst women with mothers with a child under the age of 6, it's about a 3 percentage point gap. And if you limit that to just low-income areas, it's almost a 5 percentage point gap. And so this is a really serious problem for families that are living paycheck to paycheck, especially for single-parent households. When you don't have access to childcare that can support low-income families, you've got a terrible cycle of poverty. So now we've looked in the past, and now we're hopeful that there's a path forward. I would not put much money on the Trump administration doing anything It was wonderful that the Trump campaign latched onto this issue. And I put here, even if their plan was terrible, we did some analysis of their campaign proposal and found that for the typical family in the areas that swung the most for Trump between 2012 and 2016, the average benefit would be $5.55. And for a family on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, it would be about $7,000. So that's typical of Trump proposals. But we believe this is the next big progressive policy issue. CAP works hard to make sure that the right plans and the right messages are getting into the right hands and into the right press outlets. We're also committed to working with state advocates and experts in a time when federal policy is not really moving. What we think is that places like California, as well as really any other state that's going to move on this, that they should think of this as a progressive policy issue. Here's just some stats. You know, this is millennials are now outnumbering baby boomers, and they're entering their kind of prime child rearing years. And they're a much more diverse population. I probably don't have to tell you this, the population of children under the age of 5, there's no clear racial or ethnic majority. And that leaves it up to the progressive states to lead the way forward. There is some hope. Just 3 weeks ago, Patty Murray in the Senate and Bobby Scott in the House introduced the Child Care for Working Families Act, which has garnered a lot of support among Democrats in the House and Senate. And this is a real North Star bill that would be a universal entitlement subsidizing child care for all families that are below 150% of the state median income. Captures about 75 to 78% of children, of families with children, and would limit the amount that they would have to spend on child care to 7% of their income. And this bill also would invest heavily in the ECE workforce to raise wages and help support that side of things. So what can California do? We argue that this is an infrastructure issue. That's what the Child Care Deserts project is about. This is, when we talk about infrastructure, we're so often talking about bridges and roads and schools, and that's all great. But we also need to think about child care facilities and home-based child care providers. And when state infrastructure packages are developed, this kind of care infrastructure should also be included. You know, I would hope that after this water cooler and the gubernatorial forum, that this issue can really be a driving force in the campaign for your next governor, and that this inflection point takes hold, and that you can provide a California model for what a quality ECE program looks like in the absence of federal action. And then, of course, I definitely need to invest in the early childhood workforce and to significantly increase funding for early childhood programs. Like I said, this is expensive because it's important and because it has tremendous, wonderful benefits that actually more than pay for the expense. So I'm going to wrap it up there so we have time for questions. Like I said, I would also encourage you all to check out childcaredeserts.org. And thank you. Oh, great.
And see if we have time, I guess, for about 10 minutes of questions. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Jean Marie Houston. I'm with the San Mateo County Office of Education. And you're the second person this afternoon I've heard mention childcare facilities, which is an enormously heartening to me. And I would just like you to say a few comments about what you're thinking when you talk about that as an infrastructure issue.
Yes. Is this still on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, childcare facilities are there's for a long time there was this idea that we could perhaps just kind of move down the scale from first grade to kindergarten to pre-K, and we'll just lump everything into the schools, and we'll just add on to schools. And for a lot of reasons, that's a really bad idea. Little kids have a lot of special needs from their facilities that are not met by a traditional infrastructure of a school building. There are just the nature of the child care market makes it, because it is so very difficult to actually pay the bills and get by, those capital investments it's hard to get kind of financing to start up your child care business. And so we have, these for-profit entities, some of which do good work, and the Bright Horizons and the Kinder Cares and everything, and they kind of have economies of scale, and they have ability to raise capital in a way that most nonprofit or child care providers aren't able to. So that's why we think of this as a necessary instance where there needs to be kind of government backing of financing for child care facilities. Once you can kind of get the ball rolling, it can be self-sustaining, but when you've got these huge startup costs, it's really difficult. So that's why we try to think about it in infrastructure terms.
Deneen Micheletti, California Alternative Payment Program Association. Can you tell me what you've seen in other states in regards to supporting the infant toddler providers? So in California, we really are struggling with infant toddler throughout the state. So we talk on childcare, but we have a desert's desert in regards to infant toddler capacity. Have you seen anything to incentivize, particularly providers in that area?
That's absolutely true. In most places that I've seen, the infant toddler deserts map is just everywhere. When I moved to DC, we had a 6-month-old, and finding care for him it was a full-time job for a few weeks, calling places to try and get him into somewhere. And that was, we had, the time to do that and the means to pay. But, off the top of my head, I can't think of any states that have really cracked that nut. So often there's a kind of unintended consequences problem of preschool expansion, of public preschool, kind of pulling the resources out of child care providers who are using the 4-year-olds to help pay for the infants and toddlers. And so that is a really difficult issue. I mean, there's definitely needs to work hand in hand with a paid family leave system. If I had my way, we'd have 12 months for parents to share, a la, something in the Scandinavian countries, but I don't think we're going to get there. But you raise a really good point that when you limit it to just infant toddlers, this story becomes orders of magnitude more difficult for families.
Deneen, we've got one more question, so I'm going to go over here.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
So I was encouraged to do it. As a provider, I want to let you know that there actually are facilities funds available from construction and real estate companies who want to get feet in their shopping centers. In the last 2.5 years, we've actually funded, we just finished funding at a tune of about $2.5 million into state preschool, spent $150,000. The developer spent $2.5 million and gave us a reduced rate of lease so that we would come into a shopping center and bring footprints. So I think sometimes what we suffer from is that we have a very myopic view about how things should happen or how they could happen, and we fail to embrace innovation. There are some innovative solutions that could give us facilities that could possibly desegregate early learning so that all children can have access to the same centers, and we're not putting state preschool in that classroom and Head Start in that classroom and kids with parents that can pay in that classroom and ACEs over here and somebody else over there, that we actually start looking at a holistic system of early learning that includes all children. There's money out there in a community of Americans that deeply care about this issue. And if we stop polarizing and picking political sides, I'm a neither, so I really want us to stop picking political sides because I don't fit in either camp. I honestly think that there are solutions that we can all get to, and I would tell you that any person in this room that wants a new facility, talk to Regency centers, talk to some of the large real estate developers. They've got shopping centers across the state that need footprints. The more feet in the center, the more money they can charge other tenants. And in a center that's averaging $225 per square foot, I got mine for $1.40 with all the tenant improvements included. So just some innovation that maybe we can embrace as a team. And sorry I didn't have a question, but I was dared by my staff going, you got to tell him, just do it. So I came to tell you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great. So
Yeah,
that's
that's
it.
fantastic.
We want to thank Rashid. Please give him a big round
Thank
of
you.
applause. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I have a funny little story that I told Rashid right before we started, which is his boss at the Center for American Progress, Nira Tandon, actually was an intern in Delane's office years and years ago. So I actually knew his boss, obviously before I knew him, probably before he was born. But anyway, so the world grows smaller every minute. So we are so excited to finish off this afternoon with a conversation around long-term strategies to closing the opportunity gap. We are fortunate enough to have Assembly Member Tony Thurmond join us. There he is, coming up. So while he's coming up, I'm just going to say a few words about him. Assemblymember Thurmond represents California's 15th Assembly District, which includes the East Bay communities. He serves as chair of the Assembly Committee on Labor and Employment. He's the chair of the Assembly Select Committee on STEM Education, and as a member of the Assembly Committees on Education, Health, Human Services, and Water, Parks, and Wildlife. How you have time to be here is amazing with all of this going on. He is a champion and has been for a long time in public education, which is reflected in his past legislation to provide support for district schools to keep their kids out of the criminal justice system. He is currently advocating to shift funds from the criminal justice system into preschool and after-school programs, which we heard so much about earlier today. We thank you so much for being here with us for a few minutes and to talk to us about how to build those long-term strategies. So please join me in welcoming one of our best champions, Assemblymember Thurmond.
Thank you, Camille. She gave me the hook right up front. She said, we welcome him up to give just a few minutes, right? And I'm going to follow those instructions. Thank you very much. How's everybody doing tonight? Good evening. Good evening. I know I'm in a room full of educators, and that works every time, right, when you say, give me more. I promise you I won't quiz you on anything. I promise you there won't be any slides. I'm certain that there is research somewhere that says you never do slides after dinner or happy hour or both. And so I know that you've been doing the water cooler hangout, kick it all day long. How's the flow of the water cooler been? It's been good? It's been good. Somebody in the back said it's been like a fire hydrant, you know, just coming right at you, so much information. Well, I'm loving the idea that we get to hang out by the water cooler and just have a conversation about what we do in education and what we do in early education. And as I sat here, I thought to myself, I don't have to go through all these presentations that you've had here today because you are the ones who are already on board with what we need to do to support early education. You all know all the benefits that early education provides. And so I can just come in here and say I wish to align myself with the comments of my distinguished colleagues who spoke before me, right? But what would be slightly different is I'll just be blunt about it. And in the slides that you saw, people talked about resources, and I'll just be blunt and direct. We need money. They say that you show your values by what you put in your budgets. In this country and in this state, we're doing a very poor job of showing our values when we say that our children are our future. So let's put our money where our mouth is, and let's have the political will to fund early education in this state and in this nation, and to give our kids a great opportunity to have a great future. I say that to you standing before you as the descendant of African-American slaves and immigrants from Panama and Colombia. We got to shout out somebody from Panama. Hey, we're having a reunion up in here. You know, descendants from people from Michigan by way of Mississippi. You know, my mom was an immigrant who came here to be a teacher. She came here from Panama to teach in the Bay Area. And she always instilled the values of education in us, and we had early education. And sometimes, you know, when I was, I'm about to get my AARP card, but I can still remember when I was young, sometimes I was too young to even get into the programs that would be giving us extra literacy and opportunities to learn. And my mom would just say, tell them you're older than you are. You know, she'd just say, tell them you're 6, and I was like 2. And she's just like, but she knew that exposure to learning, that exposure to reading, exposure to words, even singing. I love the first 5 slogan in the branding. You know, I hear it in the car all the time. Talk, read, sing, right? Talk, read, sing. Somebody else in here knows it. My mom knew that early education and education would be important in our lives. And sadly, my mom was very, very sick, and she lost her battle to cancer when I was 6 years old. And so, because my father had been a Vietnam vet who never returned to our family, I found my father on the internet just before my 40th birthday. And so when my mom passed away when I was 6, I was sent to live on the East Coast with a cousin who I'd never met before. And she took me in and she raised me as her son, and she saved my life. And she insisted that I would get a great public education. And when kids in my class were saying that they were going to college and I didn't really know what that meant, I went with them and I said, I'm going to college too. Later, I learned that giving young people access to preschool means that we're increasing the opportunities for them to go on to college and that they won't drop out. When I was a young person, I heard people say all the time that it costs less to send a child to Harvard than to send them to prison. But yet we haven't built any new institutions of higher education, and we continue to fund prisons, and we spend $5 billion on private prisons in the state of California. And so for those reasons, I watched the documentary 13th. I don't know if any of you have seen it. This documentary chronicles how our criminal justice system is a modern-day form of slavery, and how those who are incarcerated are made to work for pennies per day to create for companies that are traded, you know, on Wall Street. And then they go out and they turn around and they make a huge profit. I watched the documentary and I was just devastated, because I came to the legislature to find solutions to problems. And watching that documentary, I just couldn't get my mind around what will we do to change this narrative. And so I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And if these companies are going to earn all this money literally off the backs of Californians and children and families, I thought, why not tax them? Why not tax them and make them give the money to the places where it belongs, like universal preschool and after-school programs? And that's exactly what I did. I introduced AB 43 that puts a 10% tax on private prisons and companies that earn $5 billion in our state and would direct those proceeds to pay for preschool programs, for universal preschool and after-school programs. Please tell me there's no one in here from the Department of Finance in the room, because they hate it. Because the dirty little secret is that the state of California uses private prisons to keep its numbers low around prison crowding. And that's a serious issue. But we've got to be serious and intentional about the investments that we make in education and early education. And, you know, we've done a few things in the legislature, but I think it's just a beginning. It's a good start. Last year, we put $500 million in the early childhood education programs. This year, I introduced a bill called AB 435 that allows 3 counties to waive their eligibility requirements for child care programs, because we're finding that the eligibility requirements sometimes make people choose between subsidized child care and getting a promotion on their job. And that small promotion might make them ineligible. And so I'm glad that the bill AB 435 passed for Contra Costa, Sonoma counties, and Marin counties. But AB 60, which also passed, which I was a co-author of, would create a statewide guidance on making sure that we never ask a parent to forego the chance to earn more money, to work their way out of poverty because they're trying to hold on to subsidized child care. And so we've got to flip the narrative so that you can win. It should be a win-win, not a you choose one and then you choose which one you're going to keep and which one you're going to lose. We have to continue to invest more, and we've got to think about our early education programs like Head Start. And so I passed a bill this year that the governor's already signed to put more money into our free and reduced lunch program so that 400,000 kids in California can have access to the free and reduced lunch program, including the kids who are in our Head Start programs. We've got to get serious about fully funding preschool. It doesn't matter to me what form of early education a family might choose, and that's a family choice. And we had to make sure that if it's a child care center or a home center, that we create opportunities for there to be a well-trained workforce of early childhood educators who've had access to training, who can get decent wages. I've worked with so many organizations, when I hear the wages that are being paid to those to whom we entrust our children, again, we are currently not living up to the promise that we say when we say that the children are our future, but then we say we want to pay less than minimum wage to those who care for our kids and provide no training and no professional development. Unfortunately, we've gotten what we pay for. We are 43rd in the nation in 3rd grade reading and 3rd grade math, and 46th in the nation in per pupil spending, although California is the 6th wealthiest economy in the world. We can and must do better than that. And I don't know what those governor candidates said to you today, but I hope they all said to you that they would fully fund preschool. Did they say it? Well, I'll say it. I'll fight for it. I'll fight for universal preschool in our state. We need to make sure that every young person has the opportunity to have a great education. I think about my life every single time. But for an education, but for my cousin's intervention, but for great educators like you, I might have ended up in California State Prison. Instead, I ended up in the California State Assembly. Let's make that the legacy for every California young person, starting with early education. What can I tell you? You know it all already, right? Preschool gives you access to a greater chance to graduate high school. It means that you're less likely to be in special education, less likely to be held back. You'll perform better on math and reading. I know that you all have seen the state test scores that have come out on how our students are doing, that while there's some bright spots, for the most part, we've remained flat, and we have a high achievement gap. You all know that the achievement gap starts before kindergarten, and we've got to make sure that if we're serious about it, we're providing a menu of opportunities in early education to support our students, because once you fall behind, it's so much harder. And if we provided preschool, we know that we can eliminate the achievement gap. And so let's do what we can. If it's center care, if it's preschool, if it's Head Start, if it's transitional kindergarten, let's provide all of these opportunities for our young people. And then when they get to school, they will also have developed habits that will really help them. We have a huge challenge with chronic absenteeism of young students in our state. Students who've missed more than 10% of school in our state. They are often between the grades of kindergarten and 3rd grade. I'm connecting 0 through 5 and K through 3rd grade, because we know that when students don't learn to read by 3rd grade, they're more at risk to drop out of school. And it's a double benefit. If we take care of this problem, we can also provide more resources to support our schools and to support early education. Because education funding is tied to attendance, we lose money every time a student's not sitting in a seat and not prepared to learn. California leaves about $1 billion on the table in lost revenue just from chronic absenteeism of our kids. I always say that this is a problem that can pay for itself. And so all the millionaires in the room and all the business leaders in the room, I need you to make an investment in dollars for outreach. It got real quiet all of a sudden, right? An investment in outreach workers and data tracking to work with families who have chronic absenteeism. Because most school districts, while they care about tracking chronic absenteeism, they don't have the resources to hire outreach workers who can work with the family to find out what the barrier is that gets in the way of students attending school. I know this because I was on a school board. In 2008, I left the city council and I thought, I'm gonna go help kids. And I went to the school board and it was the recession. And after I got sworn in, I put my hand down and they said, we're gonna ask you to vote to close 10 schools. And I cussed a whole lot of bad words at that swearing ceremony because I said, this isn't what I signed up for. And they said, we know it's bad for kids, but we're gonna ask you to do it anyway. The worst framing I think I've ever heard. And I voted no, and I called all the city councils in our area and they gave us money to keep more than half of those schools open because those are our kids and their kids. My point is, programs that help to curb chronic absenteeism were among the first that got cut in the recession. And even with local control funding formula, it invites us to make choices about which programs we fund and which ones we don't. And so often, the programs that help to get kids back in school and ready to learn and can provide revenue for our kids are not funded. And so we need support from outside groups that will help to provide the funding for outreach workers so our youngest learners can be in school, can be ready to learn, become strong lifelong learners, and provide revenue to our schools. There's something that we can do to make sure that our young people are prepared for everything in the future, for healthy learning, for the jobs of tomorrow, and that's something that comes intuitive to them. Provide them with computer science from pre-K through 12th grade. Right now, that's a great place to put your hands together. You can clap for that, right? As young as 2 years old, these kids know how to turn on any device. I call my kids the IT department. Every time I get a device, I'm reading the manual, they snatch it out of my hand. They say, Dad, this is how you do it. Don't read that. It comes to them intuitively, but yet only 40% of our schools provide computer science. We've got to make sure that we provide this for 100% of our schools because California is the center of innovation. And so let us make the dream come true. Let us flip the script and change the narrative, and instead of incarcerating, let's educate and make sure that every single young person has a chance to get a great education. Because it made a difference in my life, I believe that we can do that for every California kid. And so will you hold us accountable to raising the money to fund the universal preschool program? Let me hear you say yeah. Are you going to hold every governor, every gubernatorial candidate, and every candidate for superintendent of public instruction, and every candidate for anything else? Hold them to that. Because I guarantee you, when you come to the Capitol next year when we're back in session, every legislator thinks that we've tackled the education funding problem because of a local control funding formula. I need you to help them understand that all we've done is restore our funding to pre-recession funding levels, and that our kids need reliable funding that we can count on to move California from being 46th in the nation to where we belong, #1 in the nation. Let's do that great work together. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to our work together.